Good evening, and thank you all for being here. It's really a great pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Erik Swyngedouw. I think a lot of people in the school are very familiar with Professor Swyngedouw's writings. You know, in the context of a design school, we're always seeking people who are writing about questions of urbanization, issues of globalization, and their writings can be really both important in terms of understanding of those situations, but also inspiring to us in terms of, you know, values, the kind of things that matter. And I think it's really hard to think of too many people who are really covering the types of issues that Erik has been dealing with over the last 20 years or so in his writing, that really touches on questions of the environment, dealing with aspects of ecology, water, many of the things that, you know, cross from architecture to landscape to urbanization. And it's really great that we're finally able to have him here and lecture to us. It's also, you know, it takes a certain European perspective, I suppose, of context of being you know, raised in Belgium and spending time in Holland and France and the UK, to go through a sort of education that starts with, I suppose, partly agricultural engineering from the beginning, then, you know, going to urban planning, and then really going to geography and the political issues. And I think the combination of those produces a very interesting set of sort of conditions where I think I'm just assuming that, kind of having had the interest in agricultural engineering, there's something very specific linked to the land and to the way things are made and so on and so forth. And then finally ending up doing a PhD with David Harvey at Johns Hopkins, you know, on probably a much more theoretical, but nevertheless the value system, I think, are still deeply rooted to the kind of local situations and understanding of those kind of themes. And of course, Erik has gone on to both by himself, but also a lot of times in collaboration with others, produce an amazing array of articles, over 100 of them, and of course many books. I also feel, just to do a little bit of a plug for us, feel very lucky that, you know, Erik was able to contribute to this book, Ethics of the Urban, the City and the Space of the Political, that's just coming out now, where he wrote a wonderful essay. So we're really happy that you're here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Erik Swyngedouw. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, not only because it is, of course, a privilege to be standing here and to address an audience like this, but also because I like talking to designers, architects, and planners. I was trained as a planner a long time ago, but I'm now institutionalized as a geographer, which is this kind of woolly thing that no one really knows what precisely it is, but which offers me the kind of space to intellectually do whatever I really want to do. And that's exactly why I like talking to designers and architects, because in contrast to me, I can just think. My thoughts can just wildly go wherever my thoughts want to take me. But you guys and girls, you have to do something. You ultimately have to turn thought into concrete and steel. And I don't know exactly myself how I would do that if I were in your sort of place, but I think that what you're doing is extremely important. So the articulation between thought and practice, I think, is what spaces like this ought to be all about. What I want to talk to you about today is the city, of course, but the city as a political space, the city as polis, not the city as just an agglomeration of bodies and stuff together, but the city qua polis, the city as the space, the place, the environment where the democratic is always contested, fought over, struggled over, and occasionally, not that very often, put into some sort of practice. And I think that is a challenge for us today. And it's this challenge that I really want to talk about, because I think we live in very strange times. And what I want to concentrate on for the next 50 minutes or so is a strange paradox. And the paradox sounds more or less as follows. Is that on the one hand, a number of interlocutors, intellectuals, academics, journalists, and others have been arguing for more than 20 years now that we're living in depoliticizing times. That there is a general aversion of disdain for the political. That things have been reduced to the techno-managerial management of the situation. That there is no real alternative possible than living in the globalized neoliberal city that we live in. The only thing we can do is manage it to the best of our techno-managerial abilities. But the real political choice is suspended. That's one side of the argument. And I would argue, for example, that to complete this, that Trump in the US or Le Pen in France are in many ways a symptom of this process of depoliticization. On the other hand, and particularly since what I and others have called the magical year 2011, and why it's magical I'll explain in a moment. Since the magical year 2011, a growing number of people worldwide in cities in many parts of the world have begun to say, no, this has to stop. We are indeed living in post-democratic times, but we want to reconquer the democratic. And also the emanation of these desires for reconquest of the democratic unfolded around the urban. So that's a strange paradox. On the one hand, we've already seen so many people fighting for something else, for democratization, and on the other hand, those argue that there is no real choice possible. It's that paradox that I want to explore, and I think I can't be in any better company than Michel Foucault, who in one of his last seminars before he died was, of course, addressing the question of the political, a bit more widely than his earlier work that all of us know and cite profusely, where he talks about the capital constructions and relations of everyday power, to in his later work consider the bigger sort of questions of geopolitical power. And in one of those seminars, he said, quite controversially and very rarely picked up by scholars of his work, is the people, and he means, of course, the people as a political category, not the population as a sociological category. The people is those who, refusing to be the population, that is the objects of biopolitical governance, disrupt the system. I think that sets the tone well for what I want to say. So the title of my talk is Insurgent Architects and the Spectral Return of the Political in the Post-Democratic City. For people who want to know more about it, this, what I'm going to talk about, is a potted summary of what is being discussed at length in these two books. I have a few chapters in the right-hand one, Can Architecture be an Emancipatory Project? It's an interesting question, isn't it? As is often the case, it is not academics who offer us the most incisive insight in the situation of our times. As we all know, it's often novelists, poets, movie makers who in many, many ways tell us exactly, with surgical precision, the analysis of the condition that we live in. We academics are usually hopelessly late in diagnosing that. So that's why I often refer to novelists. This is a quote from the great late José Saramago, great author of The City. I'm sure most of you know his wonderful trilogy of the urban condition that we're in, starting with The City of the Blind and finishing just a few years before he died with a book that was translated into English as Seeing, but which in Portuguese translates better as Essay on Lucidity. And this is a comment that he made in this book, that democracy today has become this sacrosanct principle that we treat as a piece of a museum, a display, but that cannot be questioned, not be interrogated. Let me just tell you the story of the novel, Seeing. It's a story of a city. It's actually the same city where just a few years earlier, all of the citizens went blind, except for this one woman, which was, of course, a parable of the situation that we're in. In his third installment of his urban trilogy, in the same city where sight had been restored, that city was making itself up for the great festival of democracy. The next Sunday, the citizens of the city would vote for the governors of the city. And as usual, the pundits and the journalists are arguing and debating whether the party of the left will gain or lose 1 or 2%, or whether it's the party of the right who will gain 1 or 2%, or whether it's the party of the center that will hold on to power. And everyone was excited. And then the Sunday came, a really bad Sunday. It was raining, bad weather. And in the morning, when those who put themselves up as candidates to be the governors of the urban fate of the citizens, who were anxiously awaiting the verdict of the democratic process, got a bit anxious because no one showed up to the polling stations. But in the afternoon, people started coming in and everyone sighed of relief. And that evening, when the votes were counted, when those who put themselves up would know the verdict of the people, it turned out that 50% of the population had spoiled the ballot. Panic. How can we govern the city democratically if we do not have the full democratic support of the population? Something must have gone wrong. And of course, as we now know, in Europe we do this systematically. If the people vote wrong, we hold a new election. The European Union is very good at that. It had to do it several times in Denmark and in France in the 1990s. So the governors decided to run the election again 3 weeks later. And 3 weeks later, it was a beautiful day. A spring day, and people went to the polling stations in big drones. And that night, when the votes were counted, it turned out that 80% had spoiled the ballot. This time the governors thought there was something going on. Surely there must be a conspiracy against the sacrosanct principles of a democracy. There must be some hidden terrorist cell who is masterminding this perversion of the democratic process. And of course, they went searching for the culprits with the usual tactics of intimidation, police action, incarceration, torture, to find out those who were trying to undermine civilization as we know it. They couldn't find anyone. So after 3 months of fruitless repression, the governors decided that it was time to teach the citizens of the city a lesson. They said, we, the governors of the city, are going to leave the people alone. We are going to abandon the city. expecting, of course, that in a minimum of time, without proper governing of the city, that the city would descend into anarchy, and that the citizens of the city would beg the governors to come back to restore peace and order in a disintegrating polis. So the governors left. And what happened in the city? Nothing. The teachers kept on teaching. The professors kept on professing. The butchers kept on butchering. The garbage men and women kept on cleaning the streets. End of story. So I thought this story actually captures well what I want to say. And I'm in good company. Here is Giorgio Agamben, an Italian philosopher, who already in 2006 observed that there is a shift from the model of the polis, founded on a center, that is a public center, agora, to a new metropolitan spatialization that is certainly invested in a process of depoliticization. Now, this process of depoliticization, I and others define and describe, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, as a process of post-politicization. So I would argue that we're living in post-political times, in post-political cities, increasingly constructed over the past 20 years or so in the global north primarily, but with examples to be found elsewhere too. For me, post-politicization is the gradual imposition and generalization of a discourse and practice of consensual techno-managerial governance in post-democratic forms of governance. That's a whole mouthful, but I'll explain in a moment more in detail what I mean by the reduction of the political to questions of techno-managerial governing. But then 2011 came. And 2011 was a magical year because it was the year marked by the beginning of a proliferating sequence of what I and many others have called urban insurgencies. Here is my notion of the insurgent architect. It began in one of the usual sort of spaces, the Arab Spring, which was, of course, quickly dismissed and understood as the kind of stuff that happens in these post-colonial spaces. But in a few weeks' time, this practice of urban insurgency spread like wildfire. In Spain, hundreds of thousands of people occupied for weeks Puerta del Sol in Madrid, Plaza de la Catalunya in Barcelona, the most well-known, but it was happening elsewhere. Syntagma Square in Athens was occupied for months by the outraged, as they called them. In the US, it became known, experimented with, worked with under Occupy. And of course, it continued. It was a strange sort of outburst of radical discontent that expressed, however inchoate and incoherent it was, a deep discontent with the state of the situation and called in its performative staging for something else, but that something else would operate under the banner of this empty signifier of democracy and equality. Not all of those outbursts were nonetheless remotely democratizing in the sense that you and I would like to think of it. This is my own city, this is my street. That's where I live. In the summer of 2011, just like it happened in Paris earlier, we had this violent anarchic outburst of violence that went on for 3 days. Cameron at the time, he called those protesters outcasts that should be swept from the city. Those who were not entitled to be part of the city. It's what in ancient Athens they would call the ochlos, the rabble, those who were not entitled to be citizens of the city. But then many, like in Spain here, there were these practices of what I call insurgent democracy. And this is in Spain, in Barcelona, demanding democracia real ya, real democracy now. That's a bit of a scandalous statement in Spain. Spain that had gone through a torturous history in the 20th century, the longest fascist dictatorship in continental Europe, went through a very smooth democratic transition in the 1980s. No one would dare to call Spain undemocratic, and there were these assorted insurgent architects asking for real democracy now. What's going on? What is the articulation or the difference between these forms of insurgent democracy on the one hand and the instituted forms of existing politics? And that kept on happening. This was 2 years ago for the opening of the ECB, the European Central Bank headquarters in Frankfurt, where they organized a blockupy. And let me point you to the image on the right bottom hand. It says, "Let's choose communism." Now, in the US, that's a bit of a banned term. Yeah? This is Frankfurt. 20-odd years or so after we killed that monster. And there are those asking today, let's choose communism. That's quite an outrageous statement. What is going on? And this is Paris this year, in Nuit debout, also demanding real democracy now. Now, many of those uprisings have died out. Many were just Bakhtinian, carnivalesque outbursts that staged the urban as a spectacle. But in many ways, it definitely itched the powers that be. As you know, the elites of the world meet every year in this little Swiss town called Davos, where they discuss, plan, organize the geography of the world according to their dreams and desire. It may not always work like that, but there we have the master architects of how their dreams can become geographical in the world. And of course, they're acutely aware of the barriers, the obstacles that resist the making geographical of their desire. So they publish every year the World Risk Report. It's a wonderful read, actually, big tome, 600 pages usually, where they document the obstacles to what they want to do. In 2012, the title of the risk report was called Seeds of Dystopia. And I thought, what the hell are they talking about? So I had to download the thing, 600 pages. And they referred precisely to the proliferation of these outbursts of urban discontent. I, in my naivety, thought of them in a certain way as seeds of potential rebirth of utopia of a different kind than the ones of the past. But they called it seeds of dystopia, just to indicate that it did itch the powers that be. So this sets the scene, I think, for exploring the paradox with which I introduced my talk. So the 4 themes I want to quickly go through is to, first of all, do the diagnosis of the times we're in, and to explore in somewhat greater detail what I mean by the political evacuation of the political, something that is very noticeable and that in other work I've explored in empirical detail, very noticeable in the way in which our cities are being governed. To then say something about the political. You may have noticed that I've used almost exclusively the word the political so far, and not politics, the kind of things that we used to talk about. Yeah, urban politics or national politics, the choreographies of power, representation, etc., the kind of things I hear all the time when I put on CNN, they talk about politics. I'm not particularly interested in politics these days. It's utterly irrelevant and uninteresting. I'm much more interested in the political. So I want to say something theoretically about that a political difference, as Paul Ricoeur called it, between politics and the political. Because I think that might help us to make sense of this paradoxical situation that we find in so many of our cities. I think it will help us to make sense of the insurgent democracies that are manifested in these spaces of urban rebellion. To conclude, to ask the question, the great question, again, to ask whether we can think at the beginning of the 21st century, whether we can think of a reawakening of history, as Alain Badiou calls it. That is the question of whether it is possible to think, because we in places like this, we just think. We don't do that much. Well, I certainly don't. I read, I write, and I talk. So the question is, can we think today the possibility of a new urbanity where the practices of emancipation, of freedom, equality, and solidarity can be practiced? Or should we give up on that thought? It's the only thing we can do in the 21st century is to mobilize the best of our techno-managerial abilities, and they are considerable, to massage the situation that we're in. That's the challenge. But my point will be, if we believe that there's no other city possible, we should stop talking about freedom, equality, and solidarity and become good managers and leave it at that. So that's the intellectual challenge I think I would like to leave you with at the end of my talk. So let me say something first about the process of post-politicization. I know it's a bit of an unfortunate term because of this funny prefix, post, which of course suggests a sort of temporal transformation, that once upon a time we were political and now we're not any longer, just like post-modernity sort of thing. It's not like that. That's not the meaning of the term. Maybe I should have used another one, but other people have been using this term now, and I did not want to confuse matters even further. Post-politicization is a particular set of dispositives, technical, managerial, and institutional dispositives that suspends, colonizes, or satures the political. So it's a set of dispositives that lets the political disappear, apparently. So it already suggests what I mean by the political. It was already embedded in Michel Foucault's quote at the beginning. For me, the political, and for others, the political refers to the fact that the people do not exist. Or in other words, that the people are radically heterogeneously constituted, that we have radically different desires, dreams, feelings, sensibilities, that there is no such thing as humanity, the people, as a political category. In fact, That is what underlies, of course, the promise of the democratic. The promise of the democratic is nothing else than the recognition that the people do not exist, that the people are split, radically split. So post-politicization is a particular tactic or strategy to pretend that that split is not there, to suspend it. There are other tactics of doing so. Jacques Rancière, French political philosopher, identifies at least 4 different tactics of depoliticization. Let me give you a few examples of that. Archive politics. Archive politics is the dispositif that argues that the community is inherently cohesive and fine, but its disintegration, the heterogeneity that is expressed in community, is caused by an external intruder. The extreme form of that, of course, is the ultra-politics of fascism. Yet Trump is a good example of that. We Americans are fine. What threatens the cohesion of us, the American community, is, of course, the intruder who comes from outside. By doing so, this practice or rhetoric covers up the radical heterogeneity that cuts through the name American or Bostonian or French. Metapolitics is a tactic that Marxists, and I'm a bit of a Marxist, always was, always will be, but the tactics that Marxist politics in the 20th century often mobilized, erroneously so, I think. It's a sort of standard argument where they say, it's not politics, you stupid, where the dynamics of change and the possibilities of a different world or the disintegrating world resides. It's in the economy. It is the class relationships. You want to change the world, change the class system. That is nothing else than a tactic of displacing the terrain of the political onto something else. In this case, class struggle. Also a form of suspending the democratic. So post-politicization is one particular tactic. And that's characterized by a number of things. Let me quickly go through the key characteristics of post-politicization, the way it has become increasingly entrenched in our cities over the past 20 years or so. So first of all, post-politics is sustained by the continuous invocation of a permanent state of emergency, as Jorge Agamben would call it. The permanent invocation of a state of crisis. And that articulates usually around 4 key axes: the economy, migration, security, and the environment. Dealing with a state of emergency, take immigration. Dealing with a state of emergency requires urgent and immediate action. That, of course, of necessity suspends the slow, painful, and difficult process of democratic negotiation and intermediation. Secondly, situation is characterized by what Bourdieu already called in the late 90s the economization of politics. That means that only those political choices are possible that fit onto a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. Or in other words, only those political choices are deemed reasonable that fit within a market logic. Let me give you an example of that. I come from Flanders. I grew up in a very small village in the 1960s. I'm now a professor at the University of Manchester there. I'm giving a talk at the GSD at Harvard. I never paid a penny for my education. I never paid a penny for my education. It was free and self-understood. Unquestioned from where I come from in Belgium. I'm still grateful to the extraordinary fights that were fought in order to make possible that mechanisms of distribution were there so that I was the first one out of my family to go to university, could end up as an emancipated speaker standing here. It's quite a trajectory of emancipation would not have happened, I think, without that. If I were to say today, not in the US, because that would be unheard of, but in the UK, that education should be free for all who can and wish to participate in education, they consider me to be a dinosaur who has forgotten that the 20th century is forever over. That's what is meant by the economization of politics. Of course, in urban governance, you see this repeated time after time again. And that is, strangely enough, paralleled by the depoliticization of the economic/ecological. I understand the ecological, of course, as the process through which we transform nature and allocate the fruits of that nature. So the economy is not a very good term. It's basically the ecology, the ecological issue. That cannot be politicized. In other words, there are no public choices possible about the way we access nature, transform nature, and allocate the products of that, both the goods and the bads of that. Or it can only be discussed to the extent that we reduce it to a techno-managerial issue. And all that is sustained by expert management, by us, who keep on reproducing these kind of knowledges as unquestionable. Why is that done? What makes it so attractive, so seductive? Why do so many of us desire this depoliticized configuration? I think Roberto Esposito, another Italian philosopher, comes up with a partial answer when he says that what we have today is a further deepening of what Michel Foucault already identified as biopolitical governance to what Esposito calls an immunological biopolitical governance. And immunological has to be understood as the process of suspension of the obligation to participate in the community. That is, the right to have asylum from being part of the polity. Of course, neoliberal individualism is precisely the exemplary embedding of that. But if I take a sort of more mundane situation, is the environment, the ecological issue. We know it's threatening us, don't we? And we try to mobilize all sorts of techno-managerial dispositives in order to produce asylum so that we're shielded off from the ecological or the socio-ecological excesses that threaten us. That immunological biopolitical governance is, of course, a process of not just making life, deciding who is entitled to live. That's my type. Yeah, I live in the gentrified ecotopian bubble of Amsterdam. It's wonderful, it's sustainable, and it's damn smart too. But that comes at extraordinary expense. At the same time, we produce through that those who are not immunologized, those who are exiled. The bottom of the Mediterranean Sea is filled with those bodies, which are the flip side, of course, of the immunological, biopolitical governance that is so dominant today. It's not just a process of make-live, but it's a process of make-live and make-die as two sides of the same coin. And all that is institutionally sustained by what I and others have called autocratic forms of post-democratic governance beyond the state. That is that the registers of instituted, quote-unquote, democratic governance are increasingly populated by what Ulrich Beck called unauthorized actors and unauthorized agents. It's what in the planning literature is usually called public-private partnerships, urban governance arrangements in which not only the state participates, but all sorts of private agents and actors participate, from private companies to our beloved NGOs. But these are unauthorized actors. They have absolutely no democratic or other legitimacy. Nonetheless, they increasingly decide the techno-managerial structure of everyday governing. You can feel it in your body when you walk around in a city like Athens or Thessaloniki today. You all know, of course, the chaos and the suffering that has been inflicted on the Greek people and which is manifestly sensible in places like Athens and Thessaloniki. For all those who visit it, they know, you feel it, you see it, you touch it, you smell it. It was, of course, the direct outcome of post-political techno-managerial governance, where there was no choice possible. Indeed, the conditions of crisis and of fear, which are continuously nurtured, the elites keep on telling us, can be nonetheless managed for some through the mobilization of techno-managerial dispositives. And that is further sustained by what a colleague of mine in Manchester called the tyranny of participation. In planning, you find it the whole time that where democratization is understood as the participation of citizens in decision-making processes. We're telling our beloved poor in our cities, out in the global north and the global south, that they can and should participate in the decision-making of the stuff that is important to them. That's what we tell them. Do you participate here in Boston in the management of your sewage system, transport system, educational system, cultural policies, etc.? Perhaps some of you do, I don't. I don't have the time to do so. I don't want to do that because it's a techno-managerial exercise and has absolutely nothing to do with the democratic. The democratic has to do with the fact that if my water doesn't flow in Manchester, pick up the phone and say, hey, 15 minutes and I want it to be restored. That's democracy. So in this kind of configuration, it is the most important element of that, is that the cultural condition that supports that is one that invites dispute. Dispute is not censored. Dispute is, in fact, actively invited. Now, I am the master disputer. I come up with all these critical theories and analysis, and my university loves me. They pay me handsomely for it. And I get invited to elite places to do this critical dispute of the situation that we are in. And people love it. It's invited. It is actually the support structure of. However, while dispute is invited, while we are being invited to be whoever we want to be, in gender, class, ethnic, religious terms, some things are tabooed or censored. That is the dispute, the radical dissensus, as Jacques Rancière would call it, over different forms of life, different forms of urbanity, that articulate around radically different political choices. If I were to say, I want to fight for a city of the common, that would be just about acceptable if I dress it up nicely. If I were to say, I want a communist city, I may next time not get a visa to get into the US, given what I read this morning in the newspaper. So Fukuyama, for those old enough, may just remember Fukuyama's idiotic book in 1992, The End of History, where he got Hegel completely wrong, I thought, at the time, in my youthful arrogance. Now, 30-odd years later, Fukuyama may not have been a great Hegelian, but the announcement of the end of history sounds chillingly true today. Now, this strange sense of consensus among the liberal elites that have governed over the past 20 years, that sustain this idyll of the possibility of an unfractured society, is of course ruthlessly disturbed by the fragmenting forces that animate so much of our urban life. So the fragmenting forces, the flip side, so to speak, of this attempt to eradicate the political from the spaces of social and policy encounter, or the fragmenting forces that operate around, on the one hand, the lure of identity, what Zizek and others call the ethnic evil, which of course is animating so much of our urban everyday lives. This is a golden dawn in Athens, and you all know what that symbol stands for. That is the eruptions of urban, violent, dissensual outbursts, whether we're talking about terrorist attacks to just anarchic outbursts of violence. These anarchic outbursts of violence, such as those in Manchester, and London, or Paris, Stockholm, and many other places. And there will be more. I promise you, there will be more. Read my lips. You don't have to be a genius to know that that will continue to happen, and where the elites keep on insisting that those who engage in that are rakai, scum, like those who vote for Trump, right? And of course, it is that identification that embodies the disavowal of the political. But on the other hand, the other type of fragmenting forces are those who want to fight for the new universalization. That is those who return to what Badiou calls the passion of the real of the common under the banner of equality. Those who, in their urban insurgent acting, prefigure tentatively, hesitantly, and with many uncertainties, and without much help from our types, who try to prefigure the practices of being in common, and who are experimenting in many places and cities around the world with new ways of organizing common life democratically. And occasionally, not very often, when I'm giving this talk 5 years ago, I couldn't say this, but today we can see that some of these outbursts are politically performative. Everyone, I guess, now knows Ada Colau, the new mayor of Barcelona, who was just a few years ago put in jail because he was protesting with the Indignados. And of course, in Greece, Syriza is in power, the first radical left government in the post-war period in Greece, growing out in part of these urban insurrectional movements. So in order to make sense of that, I think it's important to make a distinction between politics on the one hand and the political on the other, which are two worlds that coexist simultaneously in the urban. In French, which is such a beautifully gendered language, it's called le politique and la politique. It's very difficult to translate it into English, but it's commonly translated as politics, which is the ontic. That is the empirically verifiable tactics and strategies of urban governance with its rituals, its practices, its actors and agents. It's the kind of stuff that you and I are usually very good at. Now, give me a city for a week and I'll do you the analysis of its urban governance system. I can do that blindfoldedly. It's the ontic level of politics. Now, we seem to have reduced our thought about and our considerations of urban governing to these practices of governing, as if that colonizes the whole of the political field. The political, in contrast, is ontological, as some of my interlocutors would argue. The political is the name, the word that stands for the fact that we disagree. It stands for the radical heterogeneity that cuts through the social. And it is that manifests itself, that becomes symptomatically present in those outbursts. That's when you see it. So theoretically, there are a number of theoretical genealogies. It was Paul Ricoeur who already in the 60s made that distinction. But now there are a whole series of philosophical and political arguments that circulate around this post-foundational thought. Post-foundational thought, that is that the political is nothing else than the radical heterogeneity that cuts through the social and that manifests itself occasionally in antagonism. What happens if we add democratic to the political? And it's something that we urban theorists, or rather urban intellectuals, very rarely think about again. How many books are there about the democratic, the urban democratic of the past 20 years compared with books on urban politics and urban governance? It's so boring, I can't read them anymore. So let me remind you of a few things of what the democratic is, symptomatically, what the democratic invention, contingent as it was, insisted on. It insists, of course, on the empty place of power, as Claude Lefort would have it. That anyone and everyone can, at least temporarily, claim the place of power. But most importantly, it presumes equality. Equality understood as the axiomatic capacity of each and all to act apolitically. Contrast that with the notion of social equality. We all know we're socially unequal. Right? Marxists, feminists, post-colonialists have explored in great detail the various social inequalities that animate urban life. And progressive politics, etching itself on these inequalities, that we have to remedy them. That is a perversion of the democratic. The foundation of the democratic is the presumption of equality of each and all qua-speaking beings, irrespective of the social place we take in the geographical edifice. And the democratic is nothing else than the assertion of what Balibar would call égalité, freedom and equality fused together. And it's precisely this, what I would argue, is being suspended and disavowed in our post-democratic cities. And it's precisely in such a condition that the democratic, as an insurgent practice, manifests itself occasionally So here we begin to have, I would argue, a sense of what these insurgent architects are all about in their performing act of insurgent democracy. Because they're acutely aware, of course, that's just a performance. So the political, then, I understand as a retroactively revealed moment of eruption, an event in Badiou's term, one that is always placed and geographical and decidedly urban, that opens up a procedure that disrupts any given socio-spatial order. It's one that addresses a wrong in the name of a contingent and utterly axiomatic presumption of equality of each and every one. This wrong is a condition in which the presumption of equality is perverted to the institution of an oligarchic police order. We live today in an oligarchic police order. The political arises then in the act of performatively staging equality. A procedure that simultaneously stages equality. So it's not us, the master philosophers, who decide what equality is, but it's in the performative acting, in the bodily performance in space, that the very content and substance of equality is being defined. And it demonstrates the possibility for the inauguration of a new instituted order. This sounds very theoretical. Let me give you a simple example. Montgomery, Alabama, 1955, African-American woman called Rosa Parks. I'm sure you all remember her. She died 2 or 3 years ago. She put her African-American bum on the wrong seat of the bus. Yeah, we all know the story. Yeah. Many had done this before. What happened when you do something like that, as happened with her? You get beaten up, thrown off the bus, put in jail, or worse. Right? Why do we remember Rosa Parks? In her minimal displacement, but which nonetheless constituted retroactively a political event, in which she demonstrated a wrong, the inegalitarian order of a racialized configuration, and demonstrated equality at the same time. It is in the subsequent universalizing a procedure whereby other Americans and non-Americans, African Americans and non-African Americans, women and men, old and young, said, I am Rosa Parks too. And we call it today the Civil Rights Movement. Was it a democratizing movement? Yes, it was. Is it perfect? No, not by a long way. So, we may begin, I'm going to conclude now, we may begin to get a sense here of what insurgent urban democratic acting is all about, which is for me the sort of performativities where the democratic is kept alive against the always suturing attempts of the institutional order to suspend this. That is that insurgent democracy operates, as Michel Abensour argues, against the state, or at a distance from the state. It is, as Badiou would call, a politics of subtraction. It unfolds in public space outside of the instituted spaces of governance. The political has no foundational yet place, location, or subject. It's a process of common subjectivation. My Marxist friends hate this statement, because of course Marxists would say, it's class, you stupid. Well, it ain't. If I look at the composition of these insurgent urbanists, they're very heterogeneous. They're men and women of all sorts of ethnic, religious composition that cut through the identitarian embodiments in the name of a universalizing equality, which they consider to be the very condition of possibility to have that embodied differences. But you have to want it. It's a desire that you have to want. So that's another thing my Marxist friends don't like. It's a process of becoming subject. That is the will to take sides. Insurgent democratic acting is always specific. It's always concrete. It's always particular. Do you remember Istanbul, 2013, Gezi Park? What about a few year trees and a badly designed mosque that assembled several 100,000 people who, after a few weeks, were demanding a transformation of the constitutional order? I would argue we cannot understand what is happening today in Erdogan's Turkey without taking count of the performative democratic acting that was going on in Taksim Square in 2013. So it's specific, it's concrete, it's particular. In Sao Paulo, it was about a bus ticket. The price of a bus ticket. In Montreal, it was student fees. In Hong Kong, the umbrella movement, it was about the imposition of China of a particular political candidate. So it's always specific, concrete, but stands for the metaphorical condensation of the universal. It aims at spatialization. So it's a process that mediates the particular and the universal. And it's recognized as such. It's recognized as such. It's not difficult to discern aesthetically the difference between a universalizing, radically inclusive outburst versus an exclusive, totalitarian, identitarian one. Insurgent democratic acting here revolves around the tropes of emergence, insurrection, spatializing equality, and performative acting as a located intervention, as an interruption. It's a restaging of things. It's an interruption, as Jacques Rancière would call it, in the order of the sensible, in an attempt to reframe the common sense, to make commonsensical that what is nonsensical, such as education should be free for all. That's nonsensical in the US. An emancipatory struggle is to make that common sense. It's a decidedly aesthetic affair, as Jacques Rancière would argue. And of course, last but certainly not least, and certainly not for an audience like this, it operates in and through not only the metaphorical, but the material reproduction of its own speciality. So, to conclude, do these proliferations of urban expressions of discontent that point at a horizon beyond the existing, are these just impotent hysterical outbursts of carnivalesque behavior of disgruntled youngsters and others? Or, as Badiou asks, does the proliferation of these insurgencies suggest the possibility of what he calls the reawakening of history? I don't know. I don't know. But it's certainly worth examining theoretically and practically. Certainly if we believe that the different urbanity has to be possible. So, and I think there are three issues that need urgent attention. We all know, and certainly in this place, we all know we live in a world of planetary urbanization. Neil Brenner keeps on insisting on this, how the urban is structured in and through planetary urbanization. I very much agree with that. Nonetheless, these outbursts are highly localized, highly specific, highly concrete. I'm certainly not arguing that Cairo, Istanbul, Athens, New York, and Amsterdam are the same. Nonetheless, they do seem to express the same democratizing sentiment, although articulated around different objectivities, as Zizek would call it, and operating under very different institutional context. Nonetheless, the semblance, the leapfrogging from place to place. Last week it was in Minsk. 3 weeks ago it was in Budapest. We never had so many people at any given time coming together in urban places to express their discontent with the oligarchic order that governs planetary urbanization. So the question is, can we think through this local, global configuration? Or are there possibilities, openings to rescale, upscale, re-articulate these localized struggles into an upscaled political mobilization? And as I suggested, in the case of Spain, in the case of Greece, it seems to be possible. And other places, of course, foreclosed. I think there's extraordinary urban, political, and theoretical and practical work to be done here. Secondly, is that I think we need to urgently revisit the political names of emancipatory struggle. And we all, of course, like freedom and equality and solidarity. Who doesn't? Anyone? The question then is, who are the political subjects of its enactment? Most of us are just objects of life, of course. Yeah, I live most of my life as objects. I do what my university wants me to do. That is, I teach, I bring in money, I go and give talks, and all the rest. That's the object. So I act as an object of biopolitical governance. I act the role of the academic. Right? I do this quite well, I think. Well, my university is quite happy with me. They keep on paying me handsomely for it. But this is not what constitutes a political subject. There's no political subjectivation happening in this space. So who is it? In the past, of course, the names of emancipatory, the political names of emancipatory struggle, the subjects of that, were of course associated with particular social categories. The proletarian for Marxists, woman for feminists, the subaltern for post-colonialists. We all have a privileged little subject who is going to make the world better. Right? I think that doesn't any longer hold in the present configuration. The becoming a political subject in processes of planetary urbanization in the 21st century takes radically new forms, radically different forms, new alliances, new configurations, and new spatial manifestations of that. Also, by what means can the fight be fought? People I speak to, very few believe in the political party, locally or regionally or nationally, as the conduit to enact democratizing change. They try to experiment with new forms of institutional organization, mobilization, etc. And they don't know, and I don't know either, but I think there's an urgent task to think through what the appropriate means of organization is to begin to the lengthy, difficult process of emancipatory urbanization, and what to fight for. What terrain? In the old days, of course, it was the state. Now, the Greeks know that occupying the state doesn't do very much. It takes a bit more. It takes occupying the city, the neighborhood, the city, the state, and indeed other configurations as well. But most importantly, and I conclude with that, I think we have to dare to requilt the signifier of equality with democratic urbanity. Equality, I would argue, political equality, is what is being censored and replaced by empty notions of justice and ethics. I think we have to requilt the notion of equality and the political possibilities for the new urbanity that emerge out of that. And through that, to begin to think again the possibility of a different urbanity. Not in the utopian sense, in the way we did in the 19th and early 20th century. We're all familiar with the critiques of utopia. But utopia as that what is immediately possible and materially urgent to do, and I cannot wait much longer given the condition that we're in. And most importantly, I think, therefore, that we would stop dwelling in the comfort of immanent critique. We're so good at critiquing what we do not like. I've dwelt my whole life in the critique of urbanity and contributed too much writing on that stuff. And important as it is, immanent critique has become politically non-performative. Non-performative in the absence of quilting immanent critique with a positive dialectic of examining and experimenting what is possible. I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much.
So, Erik, will you take a few questions, see if anybody dare try and challenge you?
Please do.
So I hope that you will have some responses, some questions. You know, one thing that would be because of the context of our school,
yeah,
and because of the fact that I feel you, in many ways, at least at the beginning of your career, share some of our labor, some of our interests, whether it starts with your early beginnings, and then, of course, you know, studying planning and all of that. I think when you come to the end of your talk, I mean, it's when you are talking about this concept of requilting, and the relationship to equality. Obviously, there are many references to spatial conditions in your project. And when we think about, for example, the post-war period, it's very clear that there was a very, very particular understanding of how society had to rebuild, how the spatial had to be organized, and how through the construction of certain institutions, for example, there would be at least a version of the democratic that you are referring to.
I agree.
And today, you know, there isn't, in a sense, a very clear dimension of what democracy is in spatial terms, because then, you know, there are also people like Piketty and you know, discussing the role of capital. It seems like there is more of a division between the haves and the have-nots through a certain separation, a kind of distanciation, a kind of distances between spatial distancing between the rich and the poor. So, how do you, as a former planner at least, how do you see your own recommendations being spatialized in a context of a sort of global order where there seems to be a kind of tendency for exactly the opposite of that happening on a daily basis?
As my colleague Maria Kaika put it not that long ago, she argued the role of the architect, the designer, is not just to show people what to desire, but also how to do it. And I would argue in the post-war period, and inserted within the kind of social-democratic configuration of that time, that's precisely what architects and designers did in articulation with other instances of life. And I fear that these days, designers and planners are not any longer mobilizing their considerable technical and managerial skills to do so. Let me exemplify that. The weekend before the historic victory of Syriza in Greece, I was in Thessaloniki, a Saturday night, and you could feel electricity in the air. This was a moment of possible change, of momentous transformation, of which there are very few in a lifetime. These moments are there and far between. And I was sitting in a cafe, in a restaurant with my friends, architects, planners, designers, doing what we usually do, that is drink and talk about cities and being urban intellectuals. And in the enthusiasm of the moment, and is it going to happen or not tomorrow? Is it going to happen or not? And we didn't know, but there was the sense it might happen. So I asked then the 4 or 5 designers, architects, and planners, every single one supporters of Syriza, every single one hoping that this would be this magical moment that would open up new possibilities. Not ideal, but a new space. So I asked them, let's assume that Syriza wins tomorrow night. What are you going to do Monday morning? They looked at me as if I came from another planet, mesmerized, stunned. At that moment, I knew we were lost. At that moment, I knew there was no hope. That is, if the master planners who are working there do not know what to do, that the best thing they could come up with is reproducing what has been done over the past 20 or 30 years, as the kind of, as Maria Kaika would argue against, the artistic architecture of individual buildings in a disconnected urban fabric. Is that all they could do? Well, then there is no hope. And that's why I think we really desperately need to think through new ways of organizing the urban, thinking through what kind of urbanity is possible, think beyond the building, the artistic sort of architecture that characterizes much of the condition that we're in. On Saturday, we had a conference here, a workshop on environmental things. And I'm sure that here in this splendid environment, many are working on resilient and adaptive urbanity. Yeah? Who is against resilient and adaptive urbanity? Developing the technical and managerial technologies of becoming adaptive and resilient, so that when you're adaptive and resilient under whatever conditions, anything can happen to you. That's why I like the environmental justice activist who had this fantastic campaign in Louisiana. He said, "Don't call me resilient again. Because when I'm resilient, you will come up with something else to do to me." And that is, I think, who believes that resilient architecture and urbanity will stop the combined and socio-ecological catastrophe that is marking the condition of the earth? Is it not urgently needed to think of new ways of organizing space beyond the techno-managerial? Something that requires, in addition to these technologies, thinking through the institutional and political reconfiguration. That's why I try to insist on foregrounding the political again, in articulation with the technical and the managerial. The political has indeed been censored. I have no great answers to this, but what I do know, just came back from 6 weeks in South Africa, talking to a variety of communities who were actively trying to construct new ways of organizing, in this case, waste. I'm looking at waste, which is, of course, one of the biggest global environmental problems. They don't know what to do. And I don't know either. I don't know either. And that's why I would argue we need this extraordinary intellectual work to articulate. I work with the people in Barcelona, Podemos. They don't know either what to do. And we are not helping them. What new modalities of organizing the urban in a democratizing way? We don't know. It's an invitation to think again, to stop acting, and to think again about what a free, equal, and solidarity-based city might look like, and to take seriously the various experimentations that go on, which we either can dismiss, as I said, as outbursts, carnivalesque outbursts, or that perhaps might open the beginning of a new a political sequence that might begin to deal with the perverse, uneven and combined socio-ecological catastrophe that we are in. Ever have a thought of doing a new architecture of refugee camps? The Greeks can do with that. Or a few weeks ago, there was this fantastic design commercial in the US. I'm sure many of you have seen it, because of course some of you are going to build the wall if it ever comes. Between Mexico and the US. That's going to be an architectural masterpiece. No doubt. And some of you, generally speaking, someone's got to do it. And they will be found. And it will be great, as Trump would call it. Now, there was this advertisement of a US timber company. It became viral. I saw it on YouTube, and it was about 5 minutes long. It started off with a Mexican woman and her son on their way to America. And of course, after a few days, they came to the wall, and despair hit. And they walked around, and suddenly, in the wall, they found this gate, beautifully designed gate, through which they could enter the US. Turned out that that gate was designed and built by this US timber company. Now, that was the commercial. But I thought, here is the challenge for designers and architects. That is to design and think through, technically, managerially, in terms of the stuff, the things that pierce through, the multiple separations that keep intact, the multiple inequalities that indeed choreograph the world. And the best we seem to be able to do is either hate them, as the new right does, or show compassion, as we usually do. These are the affective politics of the post-political configuration that precisely keep the order intact. We can only change it through real, concrete, material interventions. And I think that's the challenge that designers, architects, and planners are faced with, as well as many others.
Well, I think you're not doing yourself enough justice, and I think a lot of people in the room. By that I mean, when you mentioned you've been working on waste, let's say, or your interest in water, and a lot of people here are working on different issues. Partly it seems that we have to suggest that today, if you're working on questions of urbanization, you're also spending a lot of time on the conditions that are part and parcel of those procedures. So waste is one. You know, the production of resources is another one. The way you're handling water and so on. So in some ways, it's different than the notion of a kind of continuation of the ideal city model, which might have been the post-World War kind of approach. So in a way, you are working on these recommendations, solutions, the kinds of things that really respond to a different approach to the way in which we think about cities. And I actually want to try and open it up and see if there are one or two questions or comments from the floor. I see there's a hand up there, hands up here. Maybe we can get a couple of thoughts I love the way that Erik answers things very fully. So I want to make sure that we hear from a few people before I give the floor back to Erik. So please. Yeah.
I have a question that would come with an explanation, but I promise it would be very short. The question is, I wonder what solidarity would be in a repoliticized urban politics.
Yeah.
And the explanation or the justification for that question is that it seems to me that there is a tension that maybe needs to be exposed and maybe it needs to be kept alive between solidarity and dissensus. And dissensus, or the political, because while I completely agree that we are in a moment that needs our vigilant attention to repoliticizing urban politics on so many scales, from city municipalities to geopolitical conditions. This is in tension with urban, national, and even or regional solidarities. I mean, if I would imagine the case of the European Union itself, I would completely agree that it's exercising some form of a techno-managerial despotism on so many cases. If I'm a Greek person, I would revolt against that sort of technical way of managing national states. And yet, it is a form of a geopolitical solidarity. So what might you say of that?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. So, what I mean by solidarity is solidarity with the naked other. This is precisely the opposite of humanitarianism. Yeah? That is taking care of the deserving other, which of course is just continuing the inegalitarian condition. Solidarity has to be naked. That is irrespective. Sorry. Irrespective of the bodily inscription, irrespective of whether I like the other person, he or she should be entitled equally the treatment. So solidarity is not an ethical or humanitarian injunction, but it has to be blind. That is what the great challenge is, you know, to structure solidarity with the naked other. And that is the only way, I think, to think of a freer and more equal city. That's precisely what opens up the possibility of radical heterogeneity, that he or she deserves to live irrespective of his or her condition, whether he or she is a nice person or not. I'll leave it with that.
Did you want to say something back? Yeah, actually, then take them up.
I completely agree with that point, but isn't that one scale of solidarity, which is immediate solidarity? I mean, if we think about climate change, we would have to upscale the different forms and the different layers of what solidarity is, from the naked, immediate impact of that to a geopolitical and maybe even atmospheric level.
Sure. But yeah, no, I fully agree with you. But in the present condition, and the situation is really pretty bad, we have to work with the possibilities that are there. And there are many of those. And many of them are highly localized. So another invitation I have to many of us practitioners is to articulate with the existing practices in a perspective of universalizing them out, rather than keep on insisting on that displaces the terrain onto something else. Take climate change, which we all agree is a clear and present danger that has highly uneven consequences. And we keep on insisting that in order to deal with that, we have to deal with the fetishized thing called CO2. It is carbon that is the culprit, and that needs to be managed in order to do what? In order to make sure that nothing really changes. So a real politics of climate change revolves precisely on displacing the terrain of struggle from a concern with CO2 to a political and political-ecological concern with the mechanisms and procedures through which that continuous buildup of greenhouse gases is nurtured and sustained. So these sort of displacements, I think, are vitally needed, rather than repeating the sort of fetishized little order that is staged as the dignity of the cause.
Okay, please, you go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering if you could expand on the idea of the techno-managerial governance.
Yeah. Well, with techno-managerialism, I mean that the generally recognized and hegemonically recognized issues of great concern, of which I identified four: the environment, terrorism, security, immigration, and economic financial conditions. There is a consensually established discourse that these are issues. These are issues of global concern that are manifested and lived through in our everyday urban conditions. This is consensually established and consensually agreed by almost all. Those who disagree are relegated to the margin of intellectual and cultural respectability. When Trump says climate change doesn't happen, everyone thinks he's a fucking idiot. However, the elites then say, yes, these are concerns that need to be elevated to the dignity of a global concern, but don't worry. We can't find the technical, in the case of the environment, for example, or managerial, that is institutional, like the Kyoto Protocol for the case of the environment again, that we can mobilize in order to make sure what? That civilization as we know it can continue for a while longer. So this kind of techno-managerialism does suspend the opening up of a debate over alternative or different ways of organizing our socio-energetic system or socio-ecological system. So for me and many others, techno-managerialism is a tactic that permits indeed to situate generally agreed issues or in a terrain of concern, but that simultaneously suspends the political debate over it. And by doing that, suspends the underlying causes that produced it. So for the economic financial situation, it was identical. We needed to have a set of techno-managerial dispositives bailing out the automobile sector in the United States and the banks to the tune of $1.5 trillion US, right, as a techno-managerial dispositive to make sure the civilization as we know it can continue. And there was no alternative, irrespective of the attempts, and sometimes politically powerful attempts, like in the case of Greece, that was not considered to be reasonable, rational, subject to political dispute and dissensus. It was the techno-managerialism of the Troika that had to be imposed in order to make sure that social economic cohesion could be maintained. That's what I mean by techno-managerialism. It's a set of techniques, dispositives, in the sense that Agamben gives to that suspends the political, that suspends the recognition of the radical differences that animate any kind of social order.
Erik, thank you so much for the lecture. I'm very interested on what needs to be done more than anything, yes. And I would like to bring a quick reference maybe suggest my point. That is this book on neoliberalism by Mauviot, recently published, that basically he says that the term neoliberalism, which is the current hegemonic regime that we are suffering somehow, it was coined in the late 30s, and it was not, let's say, implemented or started to, being deployed until, let's say, the mid-70s, right? So it was kind of latent for almost like, 30, 35 years, kind of being prepared for waiting the right moment to kind of like flow into the mainstream. At least this is what Hayek and Friedman and others like kind of claim. No? So, in 2008 we had like a huge, breakpoint, and nothing happens. All the, the regime is maintained, it continues the same way. So, I mean, what I'm interested is a kind of like projective dimension of this. Is like, well, was then the problem that was not an alternative in place? I mean, did we really fail over all the problems that we have been detected over the last 30 years? It was simply not a kind of an alternative ready to be implemented. So I'm very interested, of course, on all your work and what you presented here, and it resonates very well with others like the agonistic democracy of Chantal Mouffe and many others that are very well aligned. So I wonder, I mean, like, is our role to really start developing, maybe slower than we think, because things takes time, really a solid, both theoretically rigorous, intellectually, like grounded, but at the same time, socially, like embedded in a way that really, presents a, I don't know, like a solid, counter proposal to the regime that, that we are living today, as opposed to me, I mean, and I want to be very respectful of like, some flares, Podemos, I'm from Spain, I've, been living that very close, but still, I mean, is that enough? Or we should take it slowly and really treat it as a projective problem? Sorry to...
Can you hold on to that thought? Because I would like you to just do one concluding kind of comment. So there are two, if you could keep it very brief.
It's impossible. I try my best. Thank you so much, Erik, for the fantastic presentation. My question is regarding the place of insurgency, because on one hand, you're looking at the police and, of course, the historical significance of the police as the place of insurgency and also the place of power manifested in architecture of the palace or the parliament is very clear. But at the same time, we're talking about technomanagerialism, and technomanagerialism historically has been practiced and perfected arguably in corporations, transnational corporations today, that have the tendency to become more and more invisible because camouflage is an important strategy of incorporation. So it's really difficult to trace them after their trademark that we see every day on their products and in advertisement. So I guess my question is, and I'm saying this because I was following this group of activists called the Invisible Committee, and in one of their articles basically say block the roads because power is in logistics. So I guess my question is, as these designers of technomanagerialism are becoming more and more invisible and their place is becoming completely dissolved in the entire planetary urbanization and not only the cities, where is the place of insurgency? Thank you.
One more. I think my question echoes some aspects of the last one, and I want to call into question the focus on urbanity and the urban, because to go back to the parable of the blind city, I think it comes with a certain blindness to politics outside, the political outside the urban. And if we believe in planetary urbanization, then I think there's long histories of insurgent democratization that happen at the sites of plantations, at the sites of mines, at the sites of hydroelectric power dams, and all in very non-urban places, in a sense, far away, peripheral places where there have been struggles of insurgent democratization for more than a century, and histories of that being passed down. And at the other end, we also miss the scale of the kind of biopolitical and struggles over, I would say, sexual and racial embodied politics, which are also a site of insurgent democratization. So rather than dismissing the kind of post-colonial and the feminist political actors, I would want to draw more on those philosophies and histories.
We're going to have one last, because these are, I mean, I think it's wonderful. These are in a sense great comments and statements, and maybe there are some questions in them that you can also. So, Sai, you have the last word.
Oh, I feel the pressure. Thank you, Erik. So, I just wanted to probe a little more on this very, very depressing anecdote that you had. And I say depressing as a planning instructor because, I mean, the Syriza moment in many ways, you're sitting, drinking with these designers and planners, and this is the eve of a historic progressive moment, right? In many ways, Syriza wins, and that is a repoliticization of the political. And even at that moment, what are we as the academy doing wrong when designers and planners feel paralyzed, right? So if you could just comment on, because if it's not the lack of the political, there was a repoliticizing moment and still designers and planners were paralyzed. So what are we doing wrong?
Sort of. I can certainly not answer all these fantastic questions. I would love to continue discussing each of them, opening up fantastic terrains. So the three last ones, I think, can be captured in the following way. What we have done for a long time, that is to dwell in the politics of resistance, right? Which demanded the theoretical and practical location of power, so that we knew what to resist, where to resist, and how to resist, and what the political subjectivities of these forms of resistance are, whether it's gender, or class, or subalternity, which are the privileged subjects to which that resistance against the locations of power is organized. I think that is not any longer valid, if it ever was. And that brings us precisely to the situation where we're in, and where I agreed with the comment that power is now so decentered that we can't even locate it anymore, let alone fight it. I think that's not such a bad idea. Because ultimately, I would argue, historically, all emancipatory procedures were predicated upon carving out their own space and their own spatiality. Let me just finish with two simple examples to illustrate how emancipatory transformation was not initiated through forms of resisting sides of power, but rather through the construction of one's own spatiality. In Europe, in the cities of Europe in the 19th century, the workers' houses were absolutely vital places to perform, to construct a new common sense, through developing a new language, new forms of representation, new forms of organization. Of course, in the 20th century, feminism indeed established itself and became symbolizable and a formidable political force precisely through the material and symbolic organization of its own spatiality. And that is something very different from the impotent tactics of resistance against power that characterizes so much of assumedly progressive politics today. And that's where I think a lot of planning, urbanistic, and design experiments are desperately needed. That is the design, organization, metaphorically as well as materially, of spatialities for the experimentation of new forms of being together in the same way as in the past the workers did it, women did it, etc., rather than dwell in the politics of resistance, which indeed has become futile. It is really about, I would argue, about strengthening the already existing worlds within the worlds. As I said in my introduction, there are several worlds in the world, those of the existing choreographies of power and those that animate desires for change and try to experiment socially, geographically, and materially with other forms of doing it. Let's choose their site and see what we can do there.
So, Erik, I feel this has been a really special night because, you know, a lot of the times when we engage in design, as you were saying it, I think that there is a tendency to to reiterate, to reuse, to restate certain conventions that are very much part and parcel of the disciplines in a way, and assume that they always carry with them their meanings, and that the assignation of the line also carries with it the kind of the possibilities that we embed or we refer in relation to the project. And I think what I find really exciting about the discussion, and there are so many incredible people who've stayed, and I think there's a lot that can happen, is the possibility that we can really open up the relationship between the project and its possibilities in a different way, in a way that is somehow re-energized with kind of new forms of investigation. And I see that as something exceptionally positive. I wish you'd given the talk at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you'd finish by 3, and then everybody could stay and talk for like 4 hours until 6, and then we could go and have a drink. These kinds of talks shouldn't start at 6:30 or 6:45. They really need to start a lot earlier and really lead to a kind of symposium. And I feel terrible in a way that we're stopping it, because I think it's just beginning in some ways. So it's very, very exciting. And I'm very happy that they let you in. I really hope that they let you out now as well. So anyway, thank you all very much. And really, thanks to Erik. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much.